So you hear Oregon Department of Forestry, and you're probably picturing, I don't know, like park rangers, people planting trees.
Yeah, something pretty tranquil.
Exactly. Not exactly the stuff of high drama, but this deep dive we're about to take, oh, this one gets messy. Leaked emails, accusations of discrimination.
A full-blown media circus. It's got all the ingredients of a real head-scratcher.
And it all comes down to this question that seems to be everywhere these days. How do you balance qualifications with representation, especially in the workplace?
It's a debate that's playing out in all sorts of industries and organizations. But this story, this one really brings those tensions into sharp focus. Like, you can't look away from this one.
Okay, so let's start with the guy at the center of all this, Mike Shaw. He was the deputy state forester. Which, side note, that's not just like some cushy government job.
Oh, not even close.
Imagine.
Being responsible for, like, millions of acres of forest land, overseeing a massive budget, we're talking huge responsibilities.
Right. They basically act as Oregon's biggest fire department, too, right?
It's a high-stakes position, huge visibility. And then, boom, it all comes crashing down when internal emails between him and Megan Donecker, the ODF's former DEI officer, well, those emails get leaked to the press.
Okay, so for our listener who might not be living and breathing this stuff, DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, it's become this, like, essential but also kind of controversial part of a lot of organizations nowadays.
Right. It's complicated. So in these emails, Donecker, she's accusing Shaw of basically fostering a discriminatory work environment. But here's where it gets really interesting. Shaw, he insists he treats everybody the same. Doesn't matter your background, your identity, any of that.
So you've got this clash of perspectives right off the bat. Donecker saying that, his actions weren't matching his words, that there was a disconnect between what he said and what she was experiencing.
And to illustrate that, she mentions being excluded from LT meetings, which, by the way, we later figured out meant leadership team meetings. Donecker felt like this whole thing prevented her from really making DEI a core part of what the department does.
It's about feeling included, being part of the decision-making process. And for her, these LT meetings, they weren't just about logistics. It was about being at the table when the big decisions were being made.
Absolutely. And then there's this phrase that became like a total flashpoint, get back to basics. Shaw used it in one of these emails, right? But Donecker, she read it as this coded message, like a dog whistle. To her, it meant going back to this like old school male-dominated way of doing things.
It's amazing how loaded language can be in these situations. One phrase, back to basics. And it takes on all these different meanings depending on who's saying it and who's hearing it.
Totally, like two completely different conversations happening at the same time. And to add fuel to the fire, ODF already had this whole DEI action plan in place, one that specifically talked about racial inequities within the organization.
Right, so for Donecker, this wasn't just about her. She saw it as this larger pattern, and Shaw was at the center of it.
Yeah, and it's like, remember those leaked emails we were talking about? Once they hit the press, forget about it. All bets were off.
Like throwing gasoline on a bonfire.
Exactly. It's crazy how the same information can get spun in so many different directions. Depends on who's doing the spinning, I guess.
You see that all the time, though, don't you? Take the New York Post, for instance. They ran this piece, and it was brutal. Just went straight after Donecker.
They did not hold back.
Nope. Went as far as attacking her appearance, even called her, like, a pink-haired mediocrity. Their whole take was basically, look what happens when DEI goes too far. That whole song and dance.
It's an interesting choice, right? To focus on how she looks as a way to discredit her arguments.
It's a tactic, for sure. And then, on the totally opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Fox News. They went in a completely different direction with it. They were all about Shaw and his thing about hiring the most qualified people. Like, that was the hill they were willing to die on. Merit over identity, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and they made sure to point out how Oregon's been pushing DEI pretty hard, implying maybe this whole thing was part of some bigger, agenda.
It's wild, right? You've got these two completely different narratives. The New York Post on one side, Fox News on the other. And they both tap into these existing anxieties about DEI, don't they? Like, it's this zero-sum game where if you're promoting diversity, you're automatically doing it at the expense of merit.
It really makes you think, though. If both outlets are working from the same information, right, the same emails, the same background on ODF, how do they end up with such drastically different takes?
Framing. It's all about framing. The way the information's presented, the words they use, the specific details they choose to focus on, the stuff they leave out, all of it shapes how we make sense of the story. Makes you realize that even when you think you're getting the facts, there's always a lens you're looking through.
You know what I mean? It's a good reminder to get your news from different sources. Don't just stay in your echo chamber, Read between the lines. Ask yourself, okay, what's the angle here? Why are they choosing to tell the story this way?
100%.
Yeah.
And remember, the most sensational version of a story, the one that grabs all the headlines, that's not always the most accurate or the most nuanced.
It's wild, isn't it? Because it's like we're talking about this one specific case, right? This whole thing with Shaw and Donecker and the Oregon Department of Forestry. But it really boils down to this question that's everywhere these days. How do we decide what matters most when we're talking about hiring, promotions, all of that?
Exactly. It's like this ongoing debate between, on the one hand, this idea of a pure meritocracy.
Right. The best person for the job. Period.
In a perfect world.
Uh-huh.
But then you've got this push for more equity, for inclusion. And what makes this particular story so fascinating is that both sides, they're both convinced they're fighting for fairness. It's just that they have totally different ideas of what fair actually means,
Totally. And you see that clash of perspectives playing out in those emails we talked about. At one point, Donecker straight up asks, is the goal not to build DEI into the basics? To her, it's not about DEI being some separate thing, some box you check off. It's got to be part of the DNA of the organization.
Yeah, it's about moving beyond just talking the talk. It's about walking the walk, embedding those values into the culture of the workplace itself.
Right. But then you've got Shaw's perspective, and it's like that article on Fox News highlighted, he's all about hiring the most qualified. Skills. Experience, that's what matters.
It's the classic meritocracy argument, and it makes sense on the surface, right? Hire the best, most skilled person for the job. The problem is, it ignores the fact that not everyone starts from the same place. We're not all playing on a level playing field. There's this whole history of systemic barriers that can make it harder for certain groups to even get a foot in the door, let alone rise to the top.
Which brings up a question that I think is really important for all of us to think about. Can we really separate merit from all those systemic factors that might be giving some people an advantage right out of the gate? And are we even aware of our own biases when we're making those judgments?
It's a tough one. It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape. Because even with the best of intentions, we all have these unconscious biases, right? These subtle preferences that shape how we see the world and how we define merit in the first place.
It's like looking through a filter without even realizing it.
Exactly. And it makes you think about all the things we don't know about this particular case.
Yeah.
We're getting this very specific, very limited view through the lens of leaked emails and media reports, both of which have their own agendas.
Yeah.
What would Shaw say if we could sit down with him, hear his whole side of the story? What about Donecker? What about all the other people who worked at ODF?
Right. What was the vibe like in that workplace? We only have a tiny piece of the puzzle.
And that's often the case, isn't it? These situations are complex. There are so many layers, so many perspectives.
It's like you said earlier, this whole thing with the Oregon Department of Forestry, it's a microcosm of this much bigger conversation that's happening everywhere. So as you're processing all of this, dear listener, think about it. What's your definition of merit? And do you think the system we have now actually allows everyone to compete on a level playing field? Because honestly, there are no easy answers here. But by wrestling with these questions, by being willing to have these uncomfortable conversations, maybe, just maybe, we can start to create workplaces and a world that's actually fair and equitable for everyone.